So in Japan, around a third of the population are already aged over 60, a fact driven by very low birth rates, but also by people living extraordinarily long lives. People tend to have fairly healthy lives, eat fairly healthily, and actually do quite a lot of exercise. There's a bit of an exercise class going on in the park behind me. People have had swords out there a minute ago, and you see this is pretty common in parks in Japan in the morning. In Japan, there are currently 4.6 million people with dementia. Within 5 years or so, 1 in 5 of the older population will have the condition. So Japan is one of the richest countries in the world, with one of the biggest economies in the world. Yet over the last few decades, economic performance hasn't been great. Growth has been far too low for their liking, for example. Part of the reason for this is that they've got lots of older people who fundamentally aren't spending enough of their money, and we see over-saving, as you do in places like the UK. So for places like Japan, they've really got to get to grips with how do you encourage extended working lives, how do you encourage people to spend rather than save in old age. If they don't do this, the prospects for long-term economic growth aren't great. In many developed countries, migration's played a big part in reducing the average age of a population. In the UK, for example, some of the communities that come into over the last sort of decade or so have tended to be younger, tended to be more likely to have children, and as a result played a part in reducing the average age of the population. In Japan, only 2% of the population, in fact under 2% of the population, is foreign born. Tiny numbers of people, under 50 a year, are given asylum. So you've got, yes, a very homogenous society, but also one where a government has not really been able to use migration as a tool, intentionally or otherwise, to reduce the average age in the population. Some regions in Japan have attempted to encourage people to have more children as a way of addressing the demographic imbalance, but the reality is that it hasn't been very successful, and also, of course, simply having more children isn't going to solve the problem, particularly in the short term. It takes a long time for children to become economically active, around about 20 years, so in some ways the sort of traditional dependency ratio starts looking worse for the first 20 years after you start having more children.